In Space Ghost, we find Peacekeeper Officer Thaddeus Bach as he's fighting a group of thugs. Thaddeus lets the thugs know that all sentient beings have the right to live in peace, but those who infringe on those rights will have to deal with the peacekeepers. Thaddeus finishes up with the thugs, and then he proceeds to return home to his wife, who is pregnant with child. Thaddeus and his wife, Alua, are optimistic for the future as they know Thaddeus is an excellent provider and he'll be an excellent father. Now, Thaddeus is also a peacekeeper, but he's also hopeful that he'll become one of the Eidolon elite. The Eidolon elite are characterized as being some of the most elite soldiers willing to dive through darkness to see where the evil breeds. Thaddeus works hard during the recruitment process, even though he almost fails by letting his superior get the drop on him. Now, this is Temple, and he's also one crooked motherfucker, but nevertheless, he accepts Thaddeus into the Eidolon elite and assigns him to Wrath Squadron. Thaddeus and his wife are extremely pleased as they both know with the increased pay, Thaddeus can provide a much better life for his family. In the coming days, Thaddeus would go on to meet Wrath Squadron, which are an elite group of mercenaries who are all crooked in their own right. Nevertheless, Temple lets Thaddeus know that Wrath Squadron has his back, and Wrath Squadron is like, yeah, right, we have your back. But no matter, Thaddeus' first assignment is to assist Wrath Squadron in apprehending these arms dealers. As Temple is inspecting the weapons from this arms dealer, instead of arresting the dealer and giving him due process as every sentient being is entitled to, Temple simply blows this dude's head off. Temple commands Wrath Squadron to engage and to use deadly force, while at the same time conjuring up the story they're going to tell to Control to save their asses. After taking out the arms dealers, Thaddeus confronts Temple as Thaddeus is pissed, stating that there are trials and PSIs, there was no justice in what they just done. But Temple doesn't give a fuck, as he states PSIs aren't perfect and judges aren't saints. So Temple is out here dishing out his own brand of justice while keeping all the money and loot for himself. Temple goes on to tell Thaddeus that all he wants from him is 5 cycles and no one suffers but the guilty. Later that night, Thaddeus would wake Alua as he planned to get his wife to a much safer location. But before he could do so, Thaddeus is ambushed by some Eidolon elite thugs using cloaking tech. Thaddeus is subsequently knocked out, and then he wakes up chained to a chair in the clutches of Temple. Thaddeus asks where's his wife, Alua, and Temple would go on to tell him, right where you left her, enjoying the benefits of a marriage to a good soldier. Unfortunately for Thaddeus, his wife was mutilated to death by this Freddy Krueger-looking android motherfucker. But the android would go on to let Thaddeus know that his wife was pregnant with a boy. This sends Thaddeus into a blind rage as he managed to break out his bounds and engage his captors. Temple lets Thaddeus know that his problem was he always cared too much, as in order to be a phantom recruit, you can't have a heart, because you can't be killed if you have no heart. As Thaddeus charges Temple, he's unfortunately shot and put down. Temple orchestrates a huge funeral for Thaddeus, pretending that Thaddeus died in service, all the while bringing Thaddeus to a remote planet while torturing him and leaving him on that planet to die. As Thaddeus lays on the ground hallucinating about visions of his wife, he's subsequently rescued by an alien named Solomon. Solomon lets Thaddeus know that this place is not kind to the living, as plague consumes king and commoner alike. Nothing that does not sleep in his own filth remains here. But Thaddeus states he should fit in just fine, as he died long ago. Thaddeus would go on to befriend Solomon, and he would take up his daily task of mining the planet with the fierceness that only vengeance and revenge can bring. Years would go by, and Thaddeus and Solomon would become closer. Thaddeus would go on to create memorials for his wife and son, but as he is visiting these memorials, he is visited by Solomon, who's eager to show him the truth. Solomon explains that now that he knew he can trust Thaddeus, he wanted to offer him a way home. Solomon goes on to explain that the plague that consumed his planet was the plague of war. Solomon himself was known as the blood mechanic, and he engineered weapons of mass destruction that eventually wiped his race off the planet. Solomon tells Thaddeus that he never told him about this as he understands his desire for revenge. Solomon would go on to tell Thaddeus that these are not tools of war, they're simply meant to get you home. But Thaddeus has other plans as he takes up his infamous power bands, puts them on his wrist, and unleash their devastating power. Meanwhile, Wrath Squadron is still out there oppressing innocent people, but little do they know, Space Ghost is coming. Solomon warns Thaddeus not to go, but Thaddeus dons his infamous hood as Thaddeus Bach is now dead and only Space Ghost remains. As one of the members of Wrath Squadron is flying through the city, he would make it back to his house, only to find out that his house has went up in flames. As the thug runs towards his house, he's subsequently shot in the arm as a ghost would appear out the darkness. In a desperate attempt to get away from the ghost, he would run back towards his house while calling for help. But unfortunately, the explosives he had stored in his house would explode and take him out in one foul swoop. Meanwhile, another one of Wrath Squadron is making her way towards Hammer's location to respond to his distress call. But before she can get there, she's hit by a ship using cloaking tech, at which point she's confronted by none other than the ghost. Now, as she's fighting the ghost, she realizes that this is actually Thaddeus Bach, but the ghost would let her know that Bach is now dead. As she tries to shoot Space Ghost would pull the reverse Uno card and phaser this bitch off the ship. As Space Ghost grabs her and attempts to question her, she kicks Space Ghost's arm, seemingly falling to her death, yelling that Bach is finally one of them. But back in space, we see Temple and the last surviving member of Wrath Squadron attempting to flee and come up with a plan to defeat Space Ghost. But luckily for them, Space Ghost is on that ass and he tracks them to a nearby planet. Temple lures Space Ghost deep into the forest, and as Space Ghost closes in on Temple actually does manage to lure him into a trap as Temple warps away with teleportation tech and blows up the entire forest. Now Temple asks his minion if Space Ghost is dead, but unfortunately for him, Space Ghost is not dead as the ghost appears out of the distance. Now before Space Ghost can finish Temple off, they're unfortunately hit by a missile barrage as the Zorathians have now invaded, led by none other than Zorak. As the Zorathians invade the planet, Space Ghost engages the Zorathians, tearing them apart one by one, piece by piece. As all this is going on, Temple makes a desperate attempt to flee. But unfortunately for Temple, Space Ghost is on that ass. As Space Ghost is right behind Temple, one of the Zorathians managed to hit both of them and beam their asses both out the sky. Space Ghost and Temple land in the forest in separate locations. But as Space Ghost is looking for Temple, he comes across some Zorathians that are about to eat some kids. Space Ghost saves the kids, and then he takes the children to a safe location so they can wait out the initial invasion. The two children's names are Jen and Jace, and Jen and Jace are hoping that Space Ghost will help them get home to their parents. The next day, Space Ghost is escorting the kids through the forest, but as they're going through the forest, they get ambushed by some Zarathians. Now during the chaos, two Zarathians grab the kids and burrow underground. But Space Ghost is on that ass as he managed to save the kids and take out all the Zarathians. As Space Ghost spends more time with the kids, they get closer as Space Ghost reminisce about the son he never had. Elsewhere, we find Temple, who is in the clutches of the Zarathians. The Zarathians explain they respect his fighting prowess. The Zarathians go on to explain to Temple that they reproduce by injecting their young into the corpses of fallen humans. They also tell Temple that if he doesn't want to suffer the same fate, he's going to help them find Space Ghost. Now the reason they want to find Space Ghost is because Space Ghost killed many of their kind and they see him as a threat. Now eventually Space Ghost does manage to get the kids home, but unfortunately, as the kids arrive home and they go to check on their parents, they discover that all their parents have been killed. The kids turn to Space Ghost as they have no one left in the world, but unfortunately, Space Ghost knows he has to leave the kids behind in order to stop the Zarathians. Space Ghost takes off in order to stop the Zarathian invasion. As Space Ghost engages the Zarathians, he slaughters all in his wake. But as powerful as Space Ghost is, the Zarathians are attempting to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. Eventually, as Space Ghost was getting overwhelmed, he would unleash a devastating AoE blast, slaughtering every Zarathian in the area. Elsewhere, we see some Zarathians chain Temple to a wall as they plan to use Temple as bait to lure Space Ghost. And while all that's going on, Jan and Jace are still on the planet waiting out the Zarathian threat. But unfortunately for Jan and Jace, the Zarathians close in on them and they take the kids hostage in an attempt to lure Space Ghost. Now this does work because Space Ghost does come with a vengeance and he slaughters all the Zarathians that plan to harm the kids. But Space Ghost's job is not over as he knows there's still a mothership full of Zarathians he needs to deal with. As Space Ghost continues to engage the Zarathian threat, Temple has broken free of his bonds by cutting off his hand. Temple locates the power core, and he plans to make the core go critical to take out all the Zarathians. The problem is, in this close proximity to the planet, it would also take out the civilian life, but Temple doesn't seem to care about that. Space Ghost continues to engage the Zarathian threat, taking out Zarathians one by one. But as Space Ghost is facing the Zarathians, he gets third-partied by a ship, and this ship is piloted by none other than Temple, as Temple is making the core go critical and he's attempting to escape the blast radius. Temple knocks Space Ghost out of orbit, but in Space Ghost's quick thinking, he uses his ship's tractor beam to grab onto Temple's ship, and then he uses Temple's ship to slam into the mothership. At this point, the mothership is going down while Temple's ship is immobilized. So as the core of the mothership is going critical, if it falls to the planet, it'll kill most of the life in the area. In a last-ditch attempt to save everyone, Space Ghost uses his last bit of remaining strength to push the mothership out of orbit and subsequently out of the blast radius of all the civilians. It is said that Space Ghost was never seen again, but that is not the truth because Space Ghost was seen handing over Temple to the Peacekeepers. Space Ghost warns the Peacekeepers that by the time he returns, this building better be the home of justice or he'll burn it down. Space Ghost would adopt Jan and Jace, and he would go on to make up with his old friend Solomon. As Space Ghost accepts his new family and his new purpose, he's finally able to let go of his deceased wife and son, allowing them to rest in peace. The end. Thank you for watching.